Welcome to another of our NWBA online reflections, which is the second that is looking at one particular episode from the Old Testament, which is the story of Naaman. So if you haven't already watched the first one in this series, you might want to do that first, but you are very welcome to stay with this one if you would rather. But in that first one, we looked at Naaman's story through the eyes of the young slave girl whose faith and intervention kicks the whole sequence of events off. And in that, we recognised how the least significant of everyone in the cast actually becomes crucial to what then happened. And we recognised that this had its roots in her attitude and outlook. And yes, as we will go on to recognise through this reflection, we should never allow a sense of insignificance in our circumstances to cause us to assume that we can't make a difference. But before we do that, let's just recall for a moment that had she not held on to her faith, if she had not harboured within her that unflinching belief in who she was as a child of God, her belief that Naaman, for all his faults, could nonetheless be a worthy recipient of God's grace, if she had not refused to give up on her faith in God's goodness despite her own misfortunes and circumstances, then she might not have even spoken out in the first place. So yes, there are times when circumstances might leave us feeling dwarfed and insignificant, but we can still be a people of big faith. No earthly circumstances can diminish who our God is. And dare I say, we have far more use in the world if we are insignificant people with a big faith than if we are in a place of importance but fail to recognise the far, far greater significance of God. But she did have the faith and she did speak out. And we can pick up the story after she has made this confident declaration that her leprosy-infected captor can be healed. If only my master would go to see the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman goes to see the king of Aram, who sends letters to the king of Israel, and Naaman sets off with the letters, a shower of impressive gifts, and arrives at the court of the king of Israel with all this intact. So let's pick up the story by reading 2 Kings chapter 5 and from verse 7 onwards. So Naaman is in the court of the king of Israel and he has read this letter. As soon as the king of Israel, verse 7, read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he's trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Make the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." Make the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. I love this story, and particularly this almost comical scene as the king of Israel reads Naaman's letter and then goes off into this rage. Now remember that leprosy was considered a highly contagious disease, and as we're all learning at the moment, fear of contagious and deadly diseases hugely impacts the way that people and governments behave. And if you were a leper, then it wasn't just a matter of wearing a face mask. You were pretty much banished from society. You certainly didn't turn up in the inner sanctuaries of a king. So you can imagine Naaman, dressed, I guess, in all his military gear. Most of his skin would therefore have been covered so that you wouldn't know that he was in the condition he was. And then he hands in his note, like a little boy giving in a note from his mum at school. And the king of Israel goes crazy because, in essence, the entire royal household has been put at risk, and he sees the whole thing as a trick on the part of the Syrians. Now, I want to pause here for a moment and recognise something of the ongoing dynamic of this story, because it's a story that in many respects puts the power structures and the important people of the day in their place. If you read the New Testament introduction to the Gospel of Luke, there's a great line at the beginning of chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee, and his brother Philip was the tetrarch of Eritrea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias the tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of the Lord came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. And again, you can see the comedy in this statement. Here is the list of the headline grabbers and the power brokers and the territories that they'd allocated to each other and the religious power structures that they oversaw. And then as this catalogue of human status reaches its height, the balloon of self-importance is burst by this simple phrase: the word of the Lord came to a half-starved, half-eccentric hippie in the desert. And this narrative from the book of Kings kind of follows the same plot. The storyteller constantly plants the symbols of power and status into the narrative and then bursts their bubble, so to speak. It's already been done in the opening part of the chapter. Naaman is presented to us as a person of power and influence, and then comes that devastating phrase, but he had leprosy. His power and his influence counts for nothing in the face of that. And I find it interesting how so much of our present experience has followed a very similar script. Whether or not we're talking about Premier League footballers or heads of state or celebrity film stars and musicians, we've created a society where we are dominated by the symbols of success and revere those who acquire and represent them. And it's taken a worldwide pandemic for us to realise that they're no different to anyone else. It takes a worldwide pandemic to bring this all-consuming, wealth-accumulating, celebrity-driven world grinding to a halt, and for us to see things in their true perspective. And this is a story that doesn't only grind to a halt with the revelation that Naaman has leprosy. It then restarts when a young slave girl brings God into the picture. There are the earthly structures of power and wealth, and there is a devastating disease, but there is also God. And it is through her that God is introduced to the story, and the story restarts. But as the story restarts, there are an awful lot of people who need to learn some quite important things. So let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a prophet and a king? Well, don't worry if you don't know the answer, because neither did the king of Syria. Because having been told to go and see the prophet, Naaman is sent to the king. And why? Because the power structures of the day thought that was the thing to do, that somehow they could still direct events. And you can see this power structure reflected in the language used by the storyteller. Do you remember how the slave girl says in the earlier verses of this story, if only my master would go to see the prophet? And look at how that word master is then employed again in the text. In verse 3, the girl says, if only my master. And then in verse 4, Naaman went to his master. You can almost hear the message being relayed up the chain of command. Slave to soldier, soldier to king, king to king. And I guess the assumption was that the king of Israel would pass the instruction back down his chain of command. And with the structures of power came the symbols of power. And so Naaman doesn't just take a letter, he takes money and clothes and gifts. But the story still comes grinding to a halt, because the king of Israel cannot help. And all that power and status and wealth counts for nothing. Yet these two kings can't see beyond that. And we could easily stop and ask, which of them is at fault here? Is it the king of Syria for simply resorting to the power structures of the day? Or is it the king of Israel for totally removing God from the picture and having to be reminded that there is a prophet in the land? And let's remember that this is the book of Kings, the book that's supposed to be telling us the story of those that God has appointed to lead and oversee the life of God's people. And at one level, the king of Syria was right. There should have been no one more representative of God's rule and reign on earth than the king of Israel. That's what God's people were supposed to be, a nation that stood out amongst the other nations as a nation with God at its heart. And if only the king had had eyes to see, God was at work. The word of the Lord did not come to John, son of Zechariah, in the desert. The word of the Lord was there to be recognized in the courts of the king of Israel. God had been at work through the faith and fortitude of one of his kidnapped citizens. God had been at work through Naaman's willingness to ask for permission to travel. And God was at work in his own land through the presence of a prophet called Elisha. Now, in defense of the king of Israel, the king of Syria had not really explained that. With this letter, I am sending you Naaman so that you can cure him of his leprosy. And of course, the king of Syria was wrong. But the king of Israel hot-headedly just assumed that it was deliberate and tears his clothes in despair. And perhaps it's just as well that Naaman brought 10 spare sets. And the story grinds to a halt again. You know, there's a verse in Psalm 121 that was a great favourite of my dad's. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? And the reply comes, my help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. And what that slave girl unequivocally believed, and what Naaman was willing to explore, the king of Israel just could not see. And I want you to ponder that for a moment, because I think there are two pretty big realities contained in this freeze frame moment as once again the story stops in its tracks. Where does my help come from? But what we can see here, that it doesn't come from human power structures and rulers with all their talents of silver and shekels of gold. And it's that reality, a reality that has always been true, that has sent our world into panic in recent months. They can't help us. All they can do is lock us up in our homes and tell us to stay away from one another. But nothing's changed. All that recent events have really done is revealed afresh what's always been the case. The facades of success will sooner or later be revealed for what they are. But God is no less God, and God is no less present. But I don't believe that this means we should just dismiss those with earthly power, but recognise that the issue at stake is how they use it. God's kingdom is one that recognises people for their behaviour and attitudes, not their power and status. And yes, this is still a moment of potential, for the task of the king was to echo the sentiments of previous kings, and not simply to tear his clothes in despair at his lack of ability to help, but to ask the question that the psalm writer asks, and to hear the reply, my help comes from the Lord. And at that crucial moment, enter Elisha, who somehow hears of the king's distress and despair, and in the most matter-of-fact way just says, send the man to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. And again, it's a tiny detail, but did you notice that phrase, send the man? Not the commander or the master, none of this my master to your master stuff, just send the man to me. Remember that phrase, because when we come to the third of these reflections on Naaman's story, we're going to think about it again. But for now, I want you to look at this from the perspective of these two kings and everything that they represented in terms of earthly power and status. So as ever, find yourself the time and space to inhabit this story for a while. And this time, I want you to enter it from the perspective of the kings, and in particular, perhaps, the king of Israel. And I simply want to ask you or offer you some questions that I sense arise from that. And the first of those is, where am I looking for, or where am I looking to for help? The king of Israel rightly recognized that he did not have the resources to help Naaman. But instead of allowing that to spur him to look beyond himself to God, he just assumed that if he couldn't help, no one could help. The invitation to lift our eyes to the hills is in itself an invitation to look beyond our current circumstances and resources. So let yourself hear the reply of the hills, the message implicitly conveyed by Elisha and the slave girl. My help comes from the Lord. Allow God to remind you that you are not solely dependent on your own resources or those of the power brokers around us. In fact, if they seem hopelessly inadequate, let that reinforce the value of your faith even more. And then the next question you might want to ask is, who else is looking for help? For all the comedy of the moment, there is also an element of tragedy in this story. That the king of Israel saw someone else's need as a threat. And perhaps this makes us ask what preconceived ideas or assumptions or prejudices might cause us to overlook the needs of those around us. We've become almost conditioned in recent days to see each other as a threat. But let's not allow practical necessities to shape our attitudes to others. And the king of Israel saw Naaman as a threat because he saw him only in terms of his own resources. Naaman ceased to be a threat when his needs were directed to God, which brings us to a third question that we might ask ourselves. How am I using the influence and the opportunities that God has given me? As I've said, the king was not in the wrong for being the king, but he failed to use his position to steer Naaman towards the prophet of God who could help. And that stands in stark contrast to the slave girl and the prophet, who had nothing like the same measure of power and influence, but enabled the story to move forward. God has put us all in places of influence. They may not be the seats of earthly power. They may be only influence in a very small circle of friends. But as that slave girl reminds us, we can all influence someone. So how can we use our circumstances, whatever they may be, to help others hear the echo of that psalm? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. So, thousands of years later, not a lot has changed. Disease can wreak havoc, human structures of power can prove very limited, but our help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. Thanks for listening.